Richard Nixon replacing Mr. Spock? It sounds impossible, but in 1977, the former president turned actor was asked to save Paramount's Star Trek Phase 2. A desperate casting crisis threatened the utopian future before a single frame could be shot. Leonard Nimoy, seeking spiritual clarity and nursing bitter contract disputes, had walked away from the ears. He was gone. Let me say this. The political arena is behind me. The American people want entertainment. They want drama. And if the medium of television requires me to explore new frontiers, even galactic ones, then I shall apply myself with total institutional focus. During a 1980 interview in between takes for a national public radio program, William Shatner reflected on the circumstances behind Nixon's casting. Gene was in a state of absolute unadulterated panic. He had the spaceship, he had the crew, but he had no logic. I told him, Gene, look at the man I'm working with on San Clemente Coast. Shatner was referring, of course, to the NBC detective drama co-starring himself, Dick Nixon, and Bob Denver. The policewoman spinoff had taken network TV by storm. I'm talking, of course, about Dick Nixon, Tricky D. He had transitioned into television acting, looking for a second act. I told Gene, look at him. The man has an innate, unyielding adherence to protocol. He doesn't let emotion dictate his actions. He lets policy dictate them. I genuinely saw Dick as the absolute personification of a Vulcan, albeit a sweaty one. The man leaked under the studio lights. He went through a gallon of Max Factor pancake makeup a day, just trying to keep the logic from sliding off his forehead. The role of Spock's replacement, a full-blooded Vulcan named Commander Xon, was completely rewritten to accommodate the unique sensibilities of its new star. However, Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry was less than enthused. Gene didn't just dislike it, it physically compromised him. He loved his characters, and watching this rewrite happen was agonizing for him. I remember the day we shot the main bridge briefing scene for the pilot. Nixon played Xon like he was auditing for the IRS. He spent 20 minutes ad-libbing, arguing with Kirk over the requisition forms for photon torpedoes. Gene was standing in the shadows by the master console, just staring. By the third take, Gene's hands were trembling so badly he dropped his coffee. He looked at me and whispered, "He's turning the final frontier into a zoning board meeting." Gene had the shakes for a week. The front office went wild. We saw the dailies and thought it was revolutionary. I actually banged my fist on the conference table and shouted, "This is it! The fans will completely forget Spock once they see Tricky D." Nimoy wanted too much money anyway. Nixon brought gravitas. He brought demographics. We genuinely believed a paper-pushing Vulcan was the future of sci-fi. The clash between the humanist ideals of the crew and Xon's ruthless institutional legalism quickly became the defining, if deeply polarizing, dynamic of the aborted season. Damn it, Xon, I'm a doctor, not an executive accountant. You've got half the engineering crew working 80-hour weeks just to fill out your triplicate fuel consumption logs. They're drop-dead exhausted. Dr. McCoy, your emotional outburst lacks administrative merit. Exhaustion is merely a symptom of poor personnel schedule optimization. Schedule optimization? They're bleeding out down there, you green-blooded bureaucrat. Let me make one thing perfectly clear, Doctor. Starfleet Regulation 42A explicitly states that a warp drive cannot be engaged without a certified, notarized manifest. If the crew cannot handle the paperwork, perhaps they belong in a less demanding quadrant. Now, if you will excuse me, I have an audit of the sickbay medical alcohol supply to conduct. Playing against Dick was wild. I was used to Leonard, where the conflict was about emotion versus pure cold science. With Nixon, it felt like I was yelling at my landlord. He had this way of looking at you, just dead-eyed and sweaty, that made you feel like you were being audited by the IRS in deep space. Deceptively tough scene partner, but the sheer frustration of arguing about Starfleet tax codes on a starship bridge made the performance entirely genuine. Nixon's intense, unblinking commitment to his character extended far beyond the written dialogue, frequently bewildering his co-stars between takes. Dick was incredibly focused. He stayed in character between takes, sitting very stiffly in a science chair, just sweating through his pointy ears. But the strangest part was how he interacted with me. He knew that Daltons possess heavy chemical pheromones that could overpower other species with romantic passion. One afternoon on Stage 9, he pulled me aside, took out a yellow legal pad, and began intensely questioning me about the exact atmospheric range of my pheromones. He wanted to know if they could be neutralized by standard starship ventilation systems or if they required a specialized bureaucratic waiver. He said he needed to log the potential threat matrix for the permanent record. It was terrifyingly stoic. Nowhere was this administrative philosophy more apparent than in Nixon's complete reframing of Vulcan biology itself. In the third week of filming, Nixon demanded a scene exploring the Pon farr, the volatile, deadly Vulcan mating urge. "Xon, you're losing control. The blood fever. It's tearing you apart. You need to get to Vulcan, or the Pon farr will kill you." On the contrary, Captain, the human method of continuous, unstructured courtship is a catastrophic drain on productivity. 7 years of absolute administrative focus, interrupted by a strictly scheduled, mandatory 7-day window to clear the biological backlog. It is the ultimate example of time management. I have already budgeted the necessary personal time off, Jim. The paperwork is filed. As production dragged into late autumn, Nixon began actively hijacking the scripts to wage an ideological war against Gene Roddenberry's utopian, moneyless vision of the 23rd century. In the proposed episode Mudd's Market, Nixon fundamentally altered the trajectory of the franchise's premier space swindler, Hardcore Fenton Mudd. I came onto the set ready to play Harry as the usual bombastic, fast-talking rogue, but Dick wouldn't let me do the comedy. In our first scene together in the briefing room, instead of arresting me, Xon pulls out a yellow legal pad and starts analyzing my business model. Dick looked at me and said, "Look here, Fenton, your margins are entirely unsustainable. This elixir is a short-term pump-and-dump scheme. It's predatory. It creates massive regulatory liabilities. And frankly, it invites Federation antitrust litigation. You need to pivot to a long-term, market-driven capital investment strategy." He spent 40 minutes of screen time teaching Harry Mudd how to form a legitimate tax-sheltered galactic corporation. When Captain Kirk attempted to intervene, Nixon delivered an ad-libbed macroeconomic lecture that left the crew speechless. Let me say this about that, Jim. Mr. Mudd is a deeply flawed individual, yes, but his entrepreneurial spirit is precisely what this stagnant, moneyless Federation lacks. He is a job creator. We do not crush free enterprise, Captain. We institutionalize it. We subsidize the mining syndicates because capital accumulation at the institutional level is the only proven mechanism for triggering downstream prosperity, a trickle-down effect across the lower decks. When the top tier thrives, the entire quadrant benefits. To protect their volatile star from the growing fury of the franchise's creator, Paramount executives implemented a specialized internal security force on Stage 9. To ensure they blended into the background of the shots, the studio forced the guards to wear standard off-the-rack Starfleet security uniforms. The director would yell, "Security, contain the creator!" and you'd just see a swarm of red-shirted security guards tackling Gene Roddenberry into a pile of fake space rocks or dragging him away from the main console because he tried to stop Dick from turning off the ship's heating. Nixon had instituted a rolling blackout policy to reduce dilithium consumption. He made us shoot in near total darkness to flatten the utility curve. The actors were tripping over cables. Shatner was furious because his hairpiece wasn't catching the light, and Nixon was just sitting there in the dark, looking intensely smug and throwing up his double-handed V sign. Desperate to bring Roddenberry into creative alignment, the Paramount suit sank to a legendary low of corporate delusion. In order to fast-track the Nixon-Xon integration, we suggest utilizing the mind chair from the Tantalus 5 prison episode, Dagger of the Mind. If placed in Roddenberry's office, it should provide excellent visual stimuli to convince him that an administrative Vulcan is what the demographic desires. Let's make space travel profitable. They genuinely didn't realize it was a fictional prop made of painted plywood and Christmas lights. They thought it was a real therapeutic device. When the prop guys rolled the neuroneutralizer into Gene's office, he almost had a stroke right there. He screamed, "That killed Dr. Adams!" Are you trying to lobotomize me for the third quarter earnings report? The situation was unsustainable. Ultimately, the set medic had to step in, administering a heavy dose of clinical Valium directly to Roddenberry in the production booth. For the remainder of the week, the great bird of the galaxy sat confined to a folding chair, in a semi-conscious state, heavily sedated, staring blankly at the monitors while Richard Nixon audited his utopia. In search of Nimoy. With Gene Roddenberry heavily sedated in the production booth, corporate interests had total control over Stage 9, but Paramount had severely underestimated Gene's wife, Majel Barrett. The First Lady of Star Trek refused to watch her husband's humanistic vision be dismantled by an ironclad bureaucracy. Taking matters into her own hands, she covertly intercepted the production dailies, slipped past the red shirt security apparatus, and dispatched a trusted emissary to track down the only man who could restore logical order to the cosmos. Majel hired a team of Sherpas to carry a portable battery-operated 16mm projector up the mountainside. Her emissary spent 3 weeks tracking Leonard Nimoy, who was meditating in an isolated monastery in Tibet. When they finally found him, the emissary didn't say a word. They just set up a bedsheet against the ancient stone wall and projected the dailies Majel had smuggled off the lot. Footage of Tricky D demanding to see the interplanetary custom receipts for the tribbles. Leonard watched in absolute horrified silence. When the clip ended with Nixon doing the double-handed V for Victory salute, Leonard closed his eyes, let out a deep sigh, and said, "The logic is deeply flawed. Pack my ears, we're going back to Culver City." On December 4th, 1977, Leonard Nimoy walked back onto Stage 9 in full Spock regalia. Nixon recognized that his administrative stranglehold had been broken, closed his briefcase, collected his ironclad pay-or-play contract payout of $2 million, and walked off the lot forever, leaving the studio $2 million short. The financial devastation of the Nixon payout was catastrophic. When Paramount pivoted away from the Phase 2 TV series to create Star Trek the Motion Picture, they had to slash costs everywhere. That's why the crew spent the entire first movie walking around in those terrible, cheap pastel polyester jumpsuits that looked like pajamas. The gorgeous crimson military uniforms we eventually saw in The Wrath of Khan had actually been designed and prototyped in 1978. Nearly half a century after the collapse of Phase 2, a haunting question remains within the corridors of science fiction history. Could the Sweaty Vulcan have actually worked? If you step back and look at the cinematic context of the era, Dick's performance wasn't an anomaly. It was a continuation of the cold, logical, survivalist science fiction dominating the 1970s. Look at Bruce Dern in Silent Running, or Charlton Heston in The Omega Man. Sci-fi was grappling with isolation, ecological collapse, and grim systemic limits. Nixon brought that precise flavor of unyielding true logic to a franchise that was, frankly, sometimes over-sanitized by Gene's relentlessly cheerful, utopian future. Xon reminded us that even in paradise, someone still has to manage the scarcity, route the power grids, and balance the ledger. Would it have worked? No, absolutely not. It was a logistical nightmare, but looking back at those dailies, there was something hypnotic about it. You couldn't take your eyes off him. You kept waiting for him to break, to yell, to show some human flaw, but he never did. He just kept reading the regulations. It was the purest form of horror I've ever seen on a soundstage. People always ask me, "Bill, did Dick ruin the dream?" And I tell them no. The dream is vast. It accommodates the poets, the warriors, the explorers. But maybe the final frontier also needed a guy who knows where the plumbing leaks are. Dick brought a gravity to that bridge that we never quite found again. Was it Star Trek? Heavens no. But for a few fleeting weeks in the dark of Stage 9, it was magnificent.